Okay, welcome back. The title of this video is You Don't Have to Know Everything. And that's true. You don't. Just hear it from me. As a teacher, your job is not to know everything. Your job is to ignite your students' interest, help cultivate their passion, and guide them through the learning process. And I'll recycle this quotation that I've used earlier, and this is my big special effects. Education is not filling a bucket, it's lighting a fire. And that's such an important concept. There's a really huge difference between those two roles and those two actions, and it's much more valuable to give student learning skills and set them free to explore their interests than to just give them more information. And this is true even with very young students, and the Montessori and Waldorf approaches are evidence of this. So research tells us that modern Western education is still too tied and tethered to the one-directional, non-Socratic obedience model, where teachers are regarded as a source of all knowledge and students are regarded as empty vessels waiting to be filled. And this is really just too one-dimensional, and it offers little room for true creativity and the big buzzword, critical thinking. And these researchers write that the key is to allow some uncertainty into your lesson plans. So how do we do this? Well, we let students' experiences, interests, and perspectives shape and inform the lesson. It's number one. Two, we open up to the reality that you as the teacher are not the only source of knowledge or even expertise in the room. And three, you allow for the absolutely terrifying notion that the day's lesson may grow organically in a direction that you did not plan for. But of course, this is when the real magic happens. So let me use a personal example. On my very first day of formal teaching in my entire life, I was thrust into a full-time high school Spanish teaching job without a credential and zero teacher training under my belt. I wasn't even a native Spanish speaker, though I was, of course, highly formally trained in reading, writing, and speaking, which is what you need, to teach the language, but I wasn't a native speaker. On my first day in class, half of my students were native Spanish speakers. This was in basically central LA. So they knew lots of slang that I had never heard before, and they would often giggle as they sort of spouted out probably lewd slang without me really knowing what it was. And there were other situations where my Spanish knowledge fell short, such as the different salutations across different Spanish-speaking countries, just things that I was not exposed to in my formal education. And, I had graduated near the top of my class at UC Berkeley, so I had sort of gotten a bit of an ego academically. And so having holes in my knowledge as the teacher was very embarrassing. And I really couldn't bear that feeling for very long. So I realized, well, I have to change my approach. Something had to change. So I saw the absurdity of trying to always know everything about every topic that ever arose in the classroom. And at the same time, I saw the true facility of seeing myself primarily as a learning guide. So my job was suddenly not to be the source of all knowledge, but the person who helps guide the class to discover that knowledge. That's me in the photo of my first year of teaching. If someone asked about the standard salutations in Argentina after I had made this shift, I would just open up that question to the class and say, oh, well, let's see if anyone knows, because there were a lot of people who were raised in or had family from Latin America, and they would usually, somebody would know. And we would make a list on the board, and then it became a class tapping the class for that knowledge rather than just being nervous that I didn't know. And when I began to see my job as being a guide to help students learn more, explore more, shape and elevate their inquiry, analysis, conclusions, then I felt much better, and the class took on a much more effective tone. It wasn't just me trying to prove that I know more than everybody. I became a guide. But in order to do that, I had to drop my ego, my academic ego. I had to evolve from a know-it-all, which I still am a little bit, but I was a lot more then, to what I call a nurture it all, a cultivate it all, an enhance it all, solicit it all, support it all. So I had to really shift. And I'll read another anecdote, which in first person from my sister, which happened to her. As a future English teacher, I breezed through my English classes in college, writing essays fairly easily and often reading an entire book a day for pleasure. I would guess that many English teachers share that background experience. But after an incident during which I experienced a severe electrical shock, okay, I was electrocuted, I found that my ability to spell and sometimes pronounce complicated words had been compromised. This was very, very hard for me to accept and cope with. My ego really struggled. There it is again, ego. My ego really struggled with not being a perfect fount of knowledge in front of my class. I noticed the effects of my injury more when I was tired, hungry, or stressed. And one time I wrote nonu on the board when I was trying to write noun. I said el loyo poco instead of el pollo loco. And the worst was when I was in a teacher meeting trying to say devil's advocate, and I kept tripping on the word, and I said devil's advocate 3 times. And then I put my head down on the desk in frustration. These were humbling experiences to have after being an English machine for 25 years in front of my classroom. Now, the upside was that this experience gave me tremendous empathy for my students who struggle with spelling, reading, writing, and pronunciation. It's been a gift that I embrace, and now that if I'm not sure how to spell something, I say, let's look it up. And it's liberating for both students and teachers to not have to try to be perfect. And I tell my students that everybody makes mistakes, even teachers. So the growth mindset is what's key, and it gives everyone space to be human and to accept ourselves just as we are, even as we strive daily to grow and improve. Well, with that story from my sister, this video has come to an end. Thanks for joining me.